Let's turn now to the case of two young men who allegedly plotted a terrorist attack outside of a bar in Chicago a week and a half ago. Well, it turns out the plot was mostly put together by the FBI and involved a fake car bomb and a fake detonator. The two men were reportedly encouraged for months and months by undercover agents who eventually supplied them with this fake bomb. So when the day came, just one of those men was still involved. The other decided not to take part after being scolded by a religious leader, a local sheikh. But 18-year-old Adel Daoud, who was just 17 when the FBI first contacted him, now faces life in prison for punching this trigger of this fake bomb. I want to talk more about this story as well as the broader implications with Trevor Aaronson. Trevor is the author of The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War, and joins us now from Florida. Trevor, let's talk about this. You know, there are so many things going on here. First of all, the FBI talking to one of these guys since he was 17 years old. Where's the line here between entrapment and good police work?
Right. This is a pretty amazing case, but it's actually not the first time that the FBI has pursued a target who was less than 18 or younger than 18. And in this case, as with the other one, they pursued him before he became of age and then brought him along in a plot. What's particularly incredible about this case in particular is that, as you said, a religious leader counseled one of the members to not move forward in the plot. But then the FBI undercover agent told the other member who did move forward, hey, I know this sheikh, and he says this is okay, and Islam is okay with violence, and you should move forward. And this is really the first time that the FBI has used Islam in, pushing a target forward in a plot.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In some ways, this story out of Chicago seems to turn the popular idea of terrorism on its head. I mean, the FBI getting Muslim youth involved in jihad, while a sheikh tells the youth to remain peaceful. In your research, which is more common?
It's actually much more common for the FBI to say, hey, let's move forward in the plot. I mean, there's really little evidence to suggest that there is much of a terrorist threat within the Muslim community. We looked at hundreds of cases since 9/11. And in the last decade, there have been 50 cases where the FBI took someone who was on the fringes of society, was espousing unpopular or even violent beliefs, but really had no capacity to commit violence on their own. And it was the FBI undercover agent or the informant who provided that means to the target and said, hey, here's a bomb. If you'd like to move forward in this plot, we can make it happen. But in all of these cases, they never had the capacity to commit the crime on their own.
Yeah, let's backtrack just a little bit, because we should mention the 18-year-old involved who was arrested, 17 at the time when he was contacted. He was contacted because he was espousing some of these beliefs, saying some pretty harsh stuff about jihad on the internet. So this isn't somebody who was randomly grabbed. This is somebody who was contacted by the FBI because they thought that some of the stuff he said was threatening. But what you're saying is that there was never the capability to be able to carry this out. How do you suggest, how do people that you've spoken to suggest that police deal with these kind of things that are on the internet? Certainly the answer is not to ignore them.
This is a difficult question. I mean, obviously from the FBI's perspective, and when I talk to FBI agents about this, they say, hey, what are we supposed to do? Here is someone who says they want to commit violence. Are we just supposed to ignore them and think they'll mature out of it? And I think that's something we can all empathize with. I mean, you don't want to be the FBI agent who says, no, we should ignore this guy, and he actually does end up obtaining weapons and launching forward with an attack. But what defense attorneys of these men who are caught in these stings say is that, in almost all of these cases, had they been counseled rather than encouraged, they probably never would have moved forward. So, and we actually see that in this case. In this case, a religious leader says to one of them, Islam does not condone this and you should stop this. And in fact, he did. But the other one was actually encouraged by the FBI and moved forward. And I think we can kind of draw a conclusion in that there are going to be cases where susceptible men on the fringes, are willing to move forward in plots. But in this case, one was counseled out of it and the other moved forward because he was instigated by the FBI.
Let's talk about how these kind of stings, these kind of arrests make the Muslim community feel about the FBI. I mean, do you think it creates more tension and distrust to have this going on?
Absolutely. The Council on American Islamic Relations no longer has a relationship with the FBI, in part because of these aggressive type of sting operations. And what this ultimately creates is a silencing effect. Muslims who may be aware of someone in their community who may be interested in some sort of violence are going to be hesitant to go to the FBI to report this person because they don't want to be caught up in a sting. They don't want to be recruited as an informant. And it has become this adversarial relationship between Muslim communities across the country and the FBI. And what we're seeing is that most of the information coming to the FBI about the Muslim community is coming from paid informants, informants who are criminals. And there's a real question about the quality of the information, whether they're bringing in people like Abdul Daoud, who was on the fringe and may have never committed a crime, but because there is such a pressure to bring in terrorism cases, someone like that may be targeted as a result.
Yeah, certainly here at RT, we have reported on a few different cases of, FBI agents going undercover inside of mosques and actually being reported by some of the people who attend the mosques, saying this guy's acting weird. And it turned out it was an undercover agent, maybe trying to stir things up a little too much. So it's really interesting. Let's talk about Abdul Daoud. He has been arrested. He could face life in prison. Talk a little bit about the severity of the charges, of the possible sentencing, and of this case and of entrapment, really, overall.
When you look at previous cases like this, almost all of them end up pleading guilty because the prosecution, the Department of Justice at this point has a near perfect record of prosecution in terrorism stings. Juries, for the most part, have been unwilling to, express enough empathy to move forward in any kind of entrapment defense. And at the same time, because of mandatory minimum sentences, men who go to trial are looking at a minimum of 35 years in prison. So, someone like Abdul Daoud may choose to take a plea to save himself from that minimum 35 years in prison. And that's what we see in a lot of cases like this, where they end up pleading out and getting 10 to 15 years. But in some cases, there's a really good case that's coming up in Portland in January with a man named Mohammed Osman Mohammed. And his case goes forward in January, and they are arguing entrapment. And it's a very similar case to this one. The FBI provided all of the means necessary for the defendant to move forward in the plot.
So you're saying this case in Oregon, the FBI could actually be held responsible, held accountable for pushing this forward?
Every indication is that the legal team in Portland is going to pursue an entrapment defense, is going to put on trial the FBI's informant program to say, these aren't real terrorists. These men were manufactured through the very aggressive work of FBI informants and FBI agents.
How common, though, is it, Trevor, for the FBI, for these undercover agents to be held responsible, or for that matter, for these types of plots to change? It seems like we've heard so many stories of, entrapment being sort of the method that's used time and time again. What's the way to sort of turn this around or suggest a better method?
Really at this point, it requires public outrage for any kind of change in this way. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is a very slow-moving, slow-changing bureaucracy. And at this point, for the most part, the United States public has not been outraged by these. And I think they should. These are cases where the men never had any capacity to commit their crimes, and it's only because the FBI made that possible. And I would encourage viewers, when they hear about terrorist plots, and they read about them, the first thing they should look at is, was there an informant involved? Were the defendants actually ever in contact with actual terrorists, with Al-Qaeda? And in most of these cases, that's not the case. So many times the Blum plots you think of, and you think of all these terrorist cases over the last decade, most of those were actually FBI terrorism sting operations. It's
certainly hard to have outrage when you're sold the story that it was an amazing terror plot uncovered, and that's the only line that's given, and the details become a little murky after that. Great to have you on the show. Trevor Aaronson, author of the book, The Terror Factory. Thanks so much.
Thank you.